Okay, this is going to be an extremely fascinating conversation for so many of us. We always wonder, is there life beyond the stars? We see so much in the news, and we have been taught so much over the years of our lives. We almost don't know what to believe. But today's guest, Dr. Stephen Greer, is an expert in the field of UFOlogy, if you will. He's the founder of the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Global Disclosure Project, which seeks to disclose the alleged classified UFO information. Please welcome medical doctor, Dr. Stephen Greer. What's up, buddy?
Good to be with you. Great seeing you. I love being on your show.
Absolutely. Dr. Greer, we got so much to cover. I've watched you over the years. I know your work. I have seen your films. I want to be enlightened today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We'll do it.
Let's go back to the beginning. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in North Carolina. I actually did a Chapel Hill residency. I'm an emergency and trauma doctor, medical doctor. As I grew up there, from a very, very poor family, we lived in a 2-room shack with no heat, no air conditioning. Put myself through high school, college, med school. Was very involved in a lot of avant-garde issues even back then. Believe it or not, I had an African-American girlfriend in North Carolina 50 years ago. That was dangerous. I'm talking dangerous. But it was great. We grew up in a very modest background, but worked hard, got through med school, had 3 kids in med school, but got involved with this. My mom's oldest brother worked on the lunar module, that first machine that landed on the moon in 1969. And that was a Northrop Grumman. Back then it was just Grumman, it became Northrop Grumman. And he had his whole career there. And so I had a very keen interest in all of this. And when I was about 8 years old, I actually saw one of these extraterrestrial vehicles, broad daylight. This would have been about 1963 in North Carolina. And I was with my twin sister and some boys in the neighborhood. Now, my parents said, "Oh, you didn't see that? Those don't exist." I said, "Yeah, they do. People need to believe their children when they see something, honestly." So it ignited a lifelong interest. And I talked to my uncle about it. He was very supportive. He'd heard things, being a big aerospace engineer guy, working on the Apollo mission, landing on the moon, right? So I began digging into it and studying it, and here we are, 60 years later. Back in, it went from 63 to 2023. I've been digging into this. It's a deep dive.
Okay, before I get into your professional career, I just want to understand you as a person.
Mm-hmm.
You're raised, are you in a religious family? Does your family believe in a higher power?
Well, no, my family were more humanistic. They weren't religious at all, but they were open-minded, about things. My dad was Navy, World War II. Neither of them, had a religious viewpoint. But I had some experiences when I was 17. I got very sick and died. I had a near-death experience. And I learned that the conscious mind is actually based in sort of an infinite field of awareness, sort of this concept of the cosmic mind. So I had this phenomenal experience. And that introduced me to some ideas and concepts and experiences that led me to dig into this whole question of life in outer space and intelligent life elsewhere very deeply. And about 6 months after that near-death experience, I had a major encounter with an ET craft. And that was up in the mountains of North Carolina in October 1973. So there's a long kind of history of that. But, my birth family, if it didn't fit in a test tube, they didn't think it existed. I mean, they just were not at all religious.
Would it be safe to say that they were atheists?
Agnostic more, just didn't know, didn't care. They grew up in hyper-religious families and but very fanatical and strict, and so they kind of rebelled against that. So my parents were like over it. So that was their orientation. So I was sort of a clean slate. I was open-minded about things, but I didn't have any, let's call it indoctrination that you get from organized religion, which I think was probably a good thing because it gave me a more universal perspective in the long run.
You mentioned that you had a near-death experience.
Yeah.
How did you die?
Being a dumb teenage boy, I had injured my left thigh, and it got infected. And I had my own little apartment in high school because we were so poor. I ended up getting my own place, and I bicycled from Charlotte all the way to the North Carolina coast, 200 miles with this injury. It got infected, spread all through my quadricep muscle on my left leg. And, oh man, I was sick. And I said, well, I better get home. So I bicycled 200 miles back. And we were so poor, we didn't have health insurance. I didn't have to see a doctor. And so I just laid there. I got sicker and sicker and sicker. I went into renal failure, kidney failure, and liver failure from the infection, sepsis, and died. But I was by myself. So I had this amazing experience. And I didn't have any religious part of it. It was more unbounded consciousness and experiencing the cosmos and sort of the state of oneness. Beautiful. But it was so profound. And actually, after I came back into my body, I was spontaneously healed. I never saw a doctor. My fever broke. I became completely normal the next day, and it was one of these kind of miraculous things. But so I guess it wasn't my time to leave back then. But that was in the spring of '73. It was 50 years ago. But so that sort of informed a lot of my perspective on life, and but also it helped me with some other things, and that is, if you face that, you're not going to be afraid of death. And so I have sort of I call it the spirit warrior mindset, where I'm just not afraid of if I get threatened, and I've been threatened plenty with what I'm doing, because I'm sort of the lead guy trying to move a lot of really big top secret programs to the public fore in a way that's helpful. And there have been a lot of threats and, things happen. But it doesn't stop me at all. It can be concerning. But it's not stopped me. So I think that experience was very good preparatory. If there was some larger plan from some higher power, it was probably gave me all these experiences so that I could stay the course on what my task is here.
Back in those days, near-death experiences, they weren't taken as serious as they're taken today. Many people who had those experiences, they were doubted. They weren't believed. People dismissed their claims of there being something more. But we now know that consciousness, if you will, our conscious doesn't end when our heart stops beating. It doesn't end when our physical life as we know it no longer exists. Anybody who I've ever read about or seen documentaries on, they've never come back the same. They've always come back with a different level of awakening. Would you say, and interestingly enough, most come back with a more, and I don't know if I want to call it religious, but there's a deeper level of belief, if you will.
Well, I think it's a deeper level of knowing. So I call it spiritual and conscious, as opposed to religion, which connotes organized religion, which are structures of organization. So I think I make a distinction between sort of a universal spirituality and a discipline, which is fine, whether it's, this religion or that religion. But I think at the root of all of that, the foundation of it is a spiritual consciousness and knowledge. And it has less to do for me with belief than knowledge, because belief is sort of knowledge of things not yet known. But if you know it and have experienced it, then it's known. And that's why I always tell people, no, I don't believe in UFOs. You believe in the tooth fairy. But if you've seen one, and if you've dealt with classified projects, and you've dealt with the actual phenomenon directly, where you have dispositive knowledge, proof, then it's not belief. It's like, well, do I believe in this camera I'm looking at? Well, I mean, it's not a correct use of the word belief. So I think in this case, I make, as a scientist, I make a distinction between the belief in something, or what your paradigm at belief is, and what the facts are. And the facts on this are, quite frankly, overwhelming to anyone who takes a even cursory look at it.
I don't know if I got my timeline right. Did I hear you say 6 months after your near-death experience, you saw the UFO?
Yeah. Well, I had one that I saw when I was 8. And then when I was 17 and had the near-death, 6 months after that, I'd turned 18. I was away at college, and I was up in the mountains of North Carolina, and had a major, very close encounter, which was the foundation for our starting close encounters of the fifth kind, which is when humans initiate contact with these civilizations.
Okay, stop there for 1 second. Is this random? Now that you're in your 60s, do you look back over the course of your life and say, I was chosen? Because most people can go their entire life and have no interaction with alien species. They're never going to see a UFO. Right. But within a 10-year span, you saw your first UFO, you had a near-death experience, and you saw your second. Do you believe this was always going to be my destiny?
Yeah, probably. Although, you know what, I think it's a misinterpretation of an old phrase. It's called, many are called, but few are chosen. I don't think that's true. I think many are called, but few choose to answer the call. All right. In other words, you have to see, and you have to step up to that. You have free will. You have to step up to responsibility. It's like I was on a flight, and some dude in row 9 died, had a heart attack. Now, all our lawyers say, don't step into that because you'll get sued. We used to have Good Samaritan laws. Now doctors get sued if they help anyone doing anything on the street. And I said, well, I'm not going to let that man die. So I went back and ran a code blue and defibrillated him, got his heart started back. Now, I chose to do that. A lot of doctors would have stayed in their seat, not gotten up because of the risk of being sued, because there's an ambulance chasing lawyer on every street corner. But, excuse me for saying so. But, I said no. So I think there are many people have an opportunity and they take a pass. So I think where the rubber meets the road on so much of life is there's a need. Do you choose to answer it and do that or not? Now, it could be that there could be some destiny involved or some pathway, or the Buddhists would call it dharma, your life's work and path. I believe that, but you could also choose not to do it. You could choose to walk the other way. So this is the mystery of the choices we make. But, if we're made in the image of a greater being, one of those is having the creative ability to choose or not choose and use our free will. I think we're at a time now where a lot of people need to make the right choices very quickly, given what's happening on this planet. And so that's where it gets into, to me, that's the ultimate, not religious, but moral or spiritual question, is what choices we make.
Got you. And just for the sake of our audience in establishing your credentials, you are a medical doctor. You don't just have doctor in front of your name for no reason. Where did you study, and where did you practice, and how long did you practice?
Well, I studied in Tennessee, and then did my Chapel Hill residency in North Carolina, and then practiced in North Carolina for a couple of decades. And then I'm still current. I still keep my stuff current, but I'm not in the emergency department anymore. Besides, I'm too old for that. That's a tough gig, my friend. But so that's sort of my background. And during that period, what's interesting is back in the day when I'm running this emergency department, I'd been chairman of emergency medicine, and I got involved with this issue. And by 1993, when Bill Clinton got elected, I was asked to fly up to Washington to brief the administration and his first director of the CIA. So I'm a young doctor in my 30s being asked to brief the CIA director on this issue, which turned my life upside down at that point. And I'll tell you why, is that when I went to that meeting, the CIA director, the FedEx I got from my contact to him setting it up said, "You're going to be the first person to brief the director of the CIA and this administration on this," because they had just gotten sworn in January of 93. And I thought, this has got to be nonsense. There's no way that the President of the United States and the Director of CIA have made inquiries into the UFO issue and were denied access. It turns out it wasn't nonsense. It was the truth, that there were projects that were being run illegally, rogue, dealing with UFOs, that had denied the President access and his first director of the CIA. So R. James Woolsey. So that meeting was sort of my coming of age. How old would I have been? 37, something like that. And I thought to myself, how, in what universe can there be something this classified that the acting director of the CIA and the President of the United States doesn't have access? So once I learned that was the situation, I started drilling down on it further and started pulling together the first group of whistleblowers, top secret guys who'd been in these projects, and putting information together, and began to, ad hoc sort of create a network that's now led to what we call the Disclosure Project globally 30 years later. But that's how it all started. And it started because here's the funny thing about it. It didn't start because I was doing anything with the government. I was with a group of people down on a beach near Pensacola, Florida. And we were doing a close encounter of the fifth kind contact experiment where a group of people went out. We were attempting to make contact with one of these civilizations. And we had 4 of these UFOs just pop, 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 materialized in the sky right in front of us. And so at that point, we actually got a video of it. It's not very good. It was like an old high-8, and a photograph ended up on the front page of the Pensacola paper of this. So the guy who had been head of our Army intelligence and Special Forces contacted me, General Albert Stubblebine III, and some other folks who were not happy with the fact that that we were doing this, because they thought we were stepping on their toes, making open contact like this. And so it began a process where then some of the friendly guys in the system, like this friend of the CIA director, found out about this event and asked me to come up and provide these briefing materials for the president and the CIA director. So, I mean, this is a very long story, made very short. So that's sort of what happened.
Okay. In the early 90s, you're still a medical doctor.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I did this for years as a doctor. I was, by day and night, I'm a trauma guy, and then I'm in between that, flying up to Washington and going places doing this. It was kind of a through the looking glass life. Well, it still is, but most certainly was then, and also for my family.
I asked you if you were still practicing medicine in the early 90s because the leader of the free world at that time, President Clinton, and his CIA director called you.
Yeah.
Technically, they could have called anybody on planet Earth. What made you this leading expert that they would seek you out and say, hey, we need you to come to the White House and brief us in an area that is highly, highly classified?
Well, I think 2 things. One is they knew that we knew enough that we had effectively made contact with one or more of these civilizations. They knew that. They'd seen the footage. They knew the event. Number 2, I know they knew that my uncle was Northrop Grumman, big aerospace guy. And number three, they knew that I had been studying this and had collected enough evidence that, I would know my way around. I know my way around much better now than I did 30 years ago, obviously. But and they didn't have anyone else to turn to. You have to understand. And by the way, this meeting was not at the White House. It was off-site in near the Pentagon, but it was not at the White House. The more important meetings don't happen there. But so we ended up, I think they reached out to me because a good friend of the CIA directors who had a think tank, a military think tank there in Arlington, Virginia, near the Pentagon, took a great interest in what we were doing, had done about a year and a half earlier. And he reached out and at the request of the CIA director and the Clinton administration. So that's how it happened. I didn't approach anyone. They approached me, and I said, okay, I'll come up. And that's really how the genesis of this occurred. And then I found out there were some folks who were very supportive of getting this information out. And there were ones who were extremely opposed to it, and it was very dangerous. Subsequently, the president got threatened. George H.W. Bush specifically threatened him, told him to butt out. I knew this for a fact. Clinton did try to stand up an operation to penetrate those projects, which was not fully successful, and it ended up being subverted. And so, I was involved with that way back 30 years ago. But I think that, ultimately we, had some meetings at the Rockefeller Ranch with me and a group of researchers, Lawrence Rockefeller's ranch out in the Tetons. And the following summer, Lawrence Rockefeller hosted the president to go through this material. But I think he increasingly realized it was too dangerous for him. I mean, one of his good friends came to my home and blurted out in front of my kids. I told him, don't talk like this. He said, they're concerned if the president pushes on this, he'll end up like Jack Kennedy, quote unquote. So I burst out laughing, thinking this is the biggest bunch of nonsense I've ever heard. He's got Secret Service, he's got this. And they said, no, the organization that wants this stuff kept under wraps, he is no match for that. So that's when I realized this was a very grave, serious situation. And I learned subsequently from meeting with people who all the way back to Eisenhower. If you look at our YouTube channel, we have 70 or 75 top secret guys' testimony up there. One of them was a young White House Signal Corps guy who had been in Eisenhower's White House the last year of his administration, and found out that Eisenhower had been pushed aside and had lost control over these operations. So the super secret world of dealing with extraterrestrial vehicles, the ones that we've downed and crashed and retrieved and studied, the technology transfer where we've come up with advanced technologies that fly, that are man-made, that look like a UFO. We'll get into this. All that began in the 40s and 50s. But by the time Eisenhower, in his last term, what really happened is that the president trusted some people he shouldn't have. And they basically subverted him and pushed him out of operational control. He was in favor more of an open contact situation with these civilizations and the bringing forward of these technologies for peaceful purposes. There are others that wanted to weaponize them, keep them secret. And of course, the big industrialists, I mean, people like Paul Mellon, a billionaire, his grandson's on my team. Those guys did not want to upset the apple cart of big oil. And, you look at how these UFOs move. I always tell people, let's demystify this. Go look at what, the Pentagon has confirmed, that those Tic Tac, what they call the Tic Tac, and these other UFOs we've chased off the coast here, California and Norfolk, that we have footage for. And the Pentagon's confirmed they're real 3D objects. You can splice those into here, and I say, look at that thing move. I mean, it's moving, straight up, straight down, has no rockets, no jets, doesn't have an atomic power plant on board, no heat signature. And it's an electromagnetic field propulsion. But every one of those, this is the big story no one knows. Those weren't extraterrestrial. Those are ours. Those are coming out of the Lockheed Skunk Works in Northrop and EG&G and Raytheon. I know where they're made. I know who's worked on them. I mean, this is my family legacy. So I tell people, look, I mean, this stuff would, if you look at it, that's an alternative energy device. That is not consuming anything you're burning. And so if you were to put something that was stationary, in other words, sitting at your house or in your car, but not flying, that was pulling that kind of energy out of what's called the 0 point field of energy, you'd have no power bill, there'd be no pollution, and within 20 years, all poverty on Earth would be over. So the secrecy around this, however, is the reverse. If you have a handful of global super powerful interests that are controlling literally $1,000 trillion worth of assets, dealing with fossil fuels, nuclear, internal combustion engine, car engines, jets, rockets, all the oil, gas, coal in the ground, all the commodities trading based on that, it's well over $1 quadrillion. $1,000 trillion. So there's the rub, is that whether it's 2023 or 1953, those interests, which actually have more power than we, the people, the Congress and the presidency and what have you, they're the ones calling the shots on this, I assure you, not the president. Now, the myth that we've all been sold is that we have a free press, and we do on certain things, but not on this, and that we have a democracy, a democratic republic that's intact. That got subverted, and there was essentially an unacknowledged coup d'etat between 1956 and 1960. That's just the truth. And we have not gotten back on track since, and there are dire consequences of this, because if you have a rogue organization with that kind of technology where they've studied extraterrestrial vehicles and created very advanced technologies that have also been weaponized, now you're creating a situation where an unsupervised rogue group like that, that's basically a power unto itself. You remember Senator Daniel Inouye of the Senate from Hawaii. He said, I'm paraphrasing, but you can look this up, there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that's above the law and free from the law itself. Now, this is the ranking senator on Intelligence Committee and et cetera. Now, that is the world I had to step into in the 90s, but I didn't know that. Now, when I first got involved with this, I had no idea that we were looking at that kind of problem and dysfunction. But, it was a very fast learning curve for me from 1993 to 95.
Dr. Greer, you have covered so much.
Oh,
and,
did I?
Oh, my God, you covered so much.
All right, we can unpack it.
We're going to get, because I am truly fascinated by your work. And we're going to get to much of this in as much detail as possible. But I also want to do it in a way that the not so smart guys like myself understand what you're saying.
Oh, you're plenty smart.
I want to go backwards with a couple of things before we move forward.
Sure.
President Clinton, he actually did an interview, and he was and I'm not sure if it was done with Larry King, but he was asked directly, do UFOs exist? He said no. And he said it very definitively. Is his response, in your opinion, based on the fact that his life was in jeopardy?
He was ordered not to speak about it. Yes, absolutely. Now, I'm here, actually, Saturday, I'm going to see a guy who's a very famous Hollywood figure who I can't name, who has written up an affidavit about him being with Bill Clinton after Clinton left office with another big singer celebrity in a limo. And this celebrity asked Bill Clinton about this. He says, oh, yeah, they exist. And he said, go read The Day After Roswell, the book that Colonel Corso wrote about retrieving these extraterrestrial objects from in 1945 in Roswell. But he also said that George H.W. Bush had waved him off and told him, this is none of your business, butt out if you know it's good for you. And by the way, Jimmy Carter had the same thing happen. President Carter was way before my time, But I was actually with him at Obama's inauguration. But he had a sighting, and he ran on a platform saying he was going to disclose these UFO secrets in 1976. At that time, George H.W. Bush came to him also and said, "You're not going to find out anything about this, and you're not going to be told anything about it." So there are certain people who've been involved on a very high committee. It's international, dealing with this. George H.W. Bush was one of those figures. Before him, people like Paul Mellon, Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, in the 90s, 90 now, former Vice President Dick Cheney, very involved. But the people that are in that system that come up to a certain level of politics, they're not going to share that information with other people. And if someone gets into the presidency or a key position in the Senate who doesn't know, they're not going to know. So let me give you the criteria about whether you're in the need to know or not. It's whether you came up through the system and you're willing to cooperate with the agenda of the secrecy. If it sounds like if they'll do a psychological profile, I call it a soul biopsy. I'm a doctor, so but where they actually look at your values, and if they think that you will not go along with that agenda, they won't tell you anything. I don't care if you're the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So now, if you're someone who would go along with that agenda, they'll read you into some of it or brief you on some of it. The military term for being briefed or and included in a classified project is read in. But so it isn't based on your rank. This is one of the things I had to learn very early and that was Clinton's problem. They didn't trust that if he was read in, that he wouldn't go along with the agenda. So they basically waved him off, threatened him, and gave him, opportunities after he left the presidency. So he became friends with George H.W. Bush and made a lot of money in speaking fees in the oil emirates in the Mideast. And, look, that's how the game is played. The head of Army, this guy, General Stubblebine in 92, after we had this encounter on the beach, he personally offered me $2 billion if I would be quiet and work with his operation on this. And that was a serious offer. That was when $1 billion was a lot of money. It was a lot of money.
Hold on. $1 billion in 2023 is a lot of money. You were offered $2 billion.
Yep. And he went behind my back to my wife, tried to convince her for me to accept it. And I said, no, thank you. I'm not going to be an asset, and I don't care about your money. I've never cared about threats. I've never cared. It's not that I don't care about my personal security. I care about the mission of what we need to do on this planet first, and I've never cared about money. I mean, no one goes into emergency medicine for the money, by the way. You're better off owning a yogurt shop. You'd make more money. But I think that, honestly, or being a rapper, or whatever. But honestly, I mean, to me, it's like, that's the kind of nonsense that goes on. There are these quid pro quo corrupt efforts. And I think this is one of the big tests also for people in Washington is now that this is going into hearings in the Congress and there are people looking into it, are they going to stay the course whether they're bribed or threatened? Because they use blackmail, they use threats, and they use bribes.
Even before you go there, you personally have disclosed more to the world than President Clinton, the U.S. government.
Oh, yeah.
And you're still alive. Why haven't you been killed?
Well, I want to be circumspect here, but up until 1998, there were 3 people on my team killed, and I was almost killed. But I was younger and I didn't really believe that I was in that kind of risk. And a man had come to me every year, if you want the true story of this, from 1991 to 98 and said, do you want executive protection, meaning lethal force? Like Secret Service. And I said, oh no, I'm a doctor, I'm doing this stuff, and I'm a civilian. He says, well, you should have it. I said, I don't want it. So then, when he had 3 bodies fall, he came and I said, do it. And this guy's got major juice inside the system. I won't say who it is. They're very loyal and basically said, anyone makes a move towards you or anyone on your team, we'll they'll be the last thing they do. So we sort of put in a check and balance. It's sort of the old term Mexican standoff. It's sort of that's where that is. And that's been in place.
Does that still exist for you to this day?
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So you are protected by, let's call it a ghost security team, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, and they're very dedicated. They're on the side of wanting this to get resolved. And then there's tactical security that we have periodically. So I don't worry about that. I mean, look, my dad was hand-to-hand combat in the Pacific in World War II on an amphibian, and the amount of carnage and blood shed he saw. I've taken care of patients killed over a 50-cent beer, where people have taken a knife and stuck it into their gut over a beer. I tell people what we're trying to do here, where we're trying to really turn the whole world over on a path away from an extinction level event, not only environmentally, but geopolitically and otherwise, onto a path of sustainable and peaceful existence. That's worth taking a risk for, so I don't worry about it. But in the bad old days of the 90s, 25 years ago, it was bad. And I had a former director of the CIA who was killed, made to look like an accident, Bill Colby.
And that's where I wanted to go, because I wanted to go backwards, because there's so much I want to cover in this interview, so bear with me. You're a medical doctor by trade. Mm-hmm. If they wanted to get you, 9 out of 10, it's not going to come with a bullet. It's not going to come with a knife to the heart. It would probably come with, poison or anthrax or something that you swallow and it's made to look like you have an upset stomach.
Sure.
And the world is finally rid of Dr. Greer, and he can stop educating and enlightening us on all that the government is trying to keep secret.
Yeah, but there's a price if that were to happen. I just told you. And the other price is I have what I call a dead man trigger, which means something happens to me, there's a massive amount of information that's going to get released that we have not released. And there are a lot of people holding it that would be able to reach, a couple billion people. So, you don't play all your cards in the first round. This is a very long strategic procedure. And so, you have to put mechanisms in place. So that's something I put in place in the 90s, and we update it. And then, obviously when I do a big event or something, we have normal tactical security, guards and stuff. Yep. But for otherwise, those folks, they know what's in place. And ironically, a very extremely senior member of the committee, let's call it, the majority joint intelligence committee that deals with this issue, or magic or magi. I did something before I even knew this existed, in 1989, that saved one of those members' lives. And that's all I'll say. But so, they're loyal.
I want to go backwards because you mentioned close encounters of the fifth kind several times in this conversation. Explain to me what close encounters of the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth actually really means.
Okay, that's a good point. A close encounter of the first kind is seeing one of these UFOs within enough range that you see the detail of it. In other words, not a far distant. You actually see the structure. All right. A close encounter of the second kind is when it leaves some sort of physical trace or evidence, meaning a radar trace where it's landed and it leaves physical trace on the ground. I think we have 3,500 of those in our archive. Something like that. A close encounter of the third kind, remember the Steven Spielberg movie from the late 70s, is when you have an encounter actually with a extraterrestrial biological entity, EBEN, E-B-E-N, an extraterrestrial person. And a close encounter of the fourth kind is when you have an on board, where you go on board a craft. And a fifth kind, which is the highest category, is when humans initiate contact. In other words, by using a set of protocols and attempt to make contact, and they respond. Now, attempting to is not a CE5 or close encounter of the fifth kind. And by the way, there's an app called CE5 Contact. It's on all the app stores, and you can get it and practice it. It has a whole training process in there. But that's when one responds. And so that was the original project, 1990. So the original project I started was the CE5 Contact project. It led to that contact event in Florida that then led to me getting asked to come up to D.C. and do all this stuff. So, but that was the initiating program. And basically the idea of it is that since this situation has been so mucked up by covert programs, keeping it out of the main governmental and scientific world and diplomatic world, it's sort of like during the Cold War when there were physicians for social responsibility and doctors from America went over to the Soviet Union and vice versa, trying to create some kind of dialogue and relationship to help with the relationship so we didn't go to mutual assured destruction and a thermonuclear war. But this is humans initiating contact with these civilizations because the U.S. government isn't, the United Nations isn't. The only government I know that's attempted to do it with us was France, where we did a CE5 contact training event during President Sarkozy's term, and the Ministry of Defense and an admiral there were very supportive, and we did that for them, and they were very supportive, and we had some phenomenal events happen. But I think that it's sort of a non-governmental experiment in people making contact, doing it directly, until such time as the government gets its leggings on this and gets control of it, and then begins to do it themselves. Because really, the big mistake here happened in the 40s and 50s when this entire issue became so secret that it then escaped.
That's where I want to go with this. Let's go to what most of us would consider, probably not you because you're an expert, but I want to go to ground zero. July 1947, Roswell.
It happened.
Can you say with 100% certainty it happened?
Oh, yeah, it happened. I actually have known before they passed away some of the guys who were there.
Okay, hold on, because I got a series of questions, and then I could just go for it.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, I want to establish what you just did. It happened. Mm-hmm. Number two, earlier in our conversation, you spoke about, I believe it was a general that said that there was a shadow government that existed.
Oh, that was Senator Inouye. Yeah.
Okay. Many of the children of the eyewitnesses of Roswell, they spoke about, in layman's term, the men in black. These guys who came and they swore everybody the secret, and they took the alien survivors away, and they took all of the people. If you can go into as much detail about what was found, how real you know that situation to be, because then I want to go into the propulsion and the energy sources you spoke about, but it all starts there.
It actually didn't start there. That was 1947. There were apparently a couple of crash retrieval events in the late 30s and 40s. We know at the Trinity site in 1945, shortly after we detonated the first atomic bomb, there was a craft that was downed or came down in that area that we retrieved. But 1947 is the most celebrated one. That one, there were actually 3 extraterrestrial vehicles involved. We had we have a document, you'll see it in my book, Unacknowledged, which goes with the documentary Unacknowledged. When you see all these for free on Amazon Prime and whatever. But it describes a new radar system that we had put in. Now, at Roswell. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the sort of military speak here. A radar system, you and I think of it as just something that sends out a beam and it bounces off the skin of an aircraft and you trace it. Those systems can also have an active directional energy warfare system attached to it or associated with it, either within the system or very nearby. So then when something is painted or tracked on radar, it's then hit with an electromagnetic weapon, a directional weapon. Those were actually beginning to be experimented with in the 30s and 40s. By 1947, this FBI document from a field agent to J. Edgar Hoover, which we had published, states that system was switched on, and it obviously had more than just a radar component. It had to have an active electromagnetic weapon part of it. And there were 3 of these ET craft that were over that area, and I'll tell you why in a moment. 2 of them collided. One was in a bazillion pieces, not far from that Roswell Army Air Base. The other one continued westward near Socorro, impacted, and it broke, and there were extraterrestrial bodies and I know of one living ET taken from there. The third one, wasn't found, I believe it's till 1951, up in the mountains going way northwest of Roswell, up in the mountains in New Mexico.
I'm sorry to interject. Are you saying that there was a third ET that got away?
No, there was a third ET craft that crashed. But
Okay,
there was one, to my knowledge, there was one survivor that we captured. And I think I have an Army intelligence guy who was the last guy I know to see that being in 1951 at Camp Perry in Virginia. And it was in a crate wearing boxer shorts. And it didn't live much longer. So apparently it lived about 4 years in captivity.
Okay. Wow. It's a lot to unpack here. Have you had the opportunity to speak to any of the eyewitnesses of Roswell or the children of the eyewitnesses of Roswell? And what is it that they conclusively told you that you can relate to us?
Yeah, we have. And we have actually one of the children who's also a medical doctor, is up on our YouTube channel. His father was there and actually had some material. And it was interesting. It had what looked like hieroglyphic type writing on it. It wasn't, but there's some kind of symbols on this very lightweight, unusual metallic part of this craft, ET craft. But in 1995, I had a gathering in California. That was the first gathering of our whistleblowers. And I guess there were about a dozen of them there, and one of them had also been at Roswell. And we have that on a tape. So yeah, I have met with and interviewed both original folks who were there and the children of a couple of the guys who were there. And there's no question about that event. But we have in our archive, we have what we call the Disclosure Intelligence Archive, 122 of these sort of crashes and retrievals.
Okay. I believe I heard you say that you met with someone in the, I'm not sure if it was the Army or what branch of service that worked with the retrieval of these ET.
Yes.
What did he or she have to say about it? Did they get a look at the alien itself?
Oh, yeah.
Or if not, did they get a look at the wrecked spaceship? What exactly did they tell you?
Well, if you look at the interview we did with Sergeant Clifford Stone, he was on a retrieval team in the 60s. Now this was after Roswell, almost 20 years. He was on multiple of these, where he was involved with not only the vehicles, but retrieval of the beings, the extraterrestrial beings, some of whom were living. And so I've interviewed a number of these sort of men. Very few of them have come forward publicly. The most recent one was a man who was on a retrieval team in, I believe it was 2011, out in the north of so-called Area 51. And there was a very large ET craft that was stunned with an electromagnetic weapon that came down, but it did not crash. It was stunned. And this man had a very close encounter with two of the ETs that came out of the craft. But that craft eventually was able to restarted itself and took off. But it's a very long story. We're in the process of trying to bring him into D.C. to go to the Pentagon, where they're debriefing folks right now that we're identifying. You have to understand, I have debriefed over 1,000 men and women like this. And I have in my archive 755 of them. The others are ones who never wanted to give us their contact information. So I'm sort of have debriefed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people like this over the last, now, 30 years. But it's been a long path. But what my job is to take all, because the what's called top secret special compartmented information, where it's very compartmented, is to get as much of the information from hundreds and hundreds of these sources and put it together in some kind of coherent picture and assessment, like an intelligence assessment. So that's what I started doing in the early 90s, and I still continue to do it. And we provide those to people in Congress and to people in the White House and Pentagon upon request. We're a private organization. So,
understood. When you spoke to the general or to any of the people who were either eyewitnesses or part of the retrieval team, mm-hmm. who actually saw the ET, whether it was the one that passed or the one that they captured alive, mm-hmm. are the images that we see of aliens accurate? Are they these short creatures with huge heads, big eyeballs?
Not really. I mean, there are some that resemble that a little bit. There's one species that's about 39 inches tall, but the skin color of, sort of a brownish gray, no hair, very fine lips, no external pinna, ear flaps, the chimpanzee ears we have. They don't have those. They just have an opening. And there are others that are much larger. Remember, there's at least 60 to 70 species that have been cataloged, the people I've worked with. I think Sergeant Stone said there were, at that time, 68 or 69 species. And some they're various sizes and what have you. So a lot of that's sort of a caricature in pop culture. I'll also just say, be careful of what's out there in that kind of public domain. A lot of that is disinformation, false information. Because the ones that are the caricature you're talking about are actually man-made ones that are made to look alien and aren't. Those are the ones that are using all kinds of technologies to, quote-unquote, abduct people. Those aren't being done by extraterrestrials. Those are being done by the fake aliens. And we have a whole dossier on that, going back to the late 50s, early 60s. The Betty and Barney Hill case everyone's heard about, that was one of our anti-gravs with some good stagecraft, making it look like an aliens abducted that couple. Absolutely. Now, why would that happen? Is because there's a certain rogue element that want to create the specter of a threat from outer space. Because really what they want to do, they want to create a global totalitarian superstate where the people are united against some alien threat. And that is the big, super big picture that people need to understand. It's why I would say 90+% of everything out there on this subject is some type of disinformation that's being curated for its what's called psychological warfare value. It's a complex problem. And actually, that agenda started in 1953 at least. I have a document from a sitting CI director General Walter Bedell Smith. And CIA Director Smith in 1953, in a document we acquired, describes to the Psychological Strategy Board of the CIA the psychological warfare value of the UFO subject. And then there's a colleague of mine, Dr. Jacques Vallée, who was sort of like his work became the sort of inspiration for the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind that Steven Spielberg did. And he won't release this because I think he's been threatened, but it's a CIA document from 1985 where it describes the CIA conducting alien abductions in Brazil and Argentina on poor people in remote areas using man-made UFOs that are these anti-grav devices and specialized things that look like an alien, but it's actually a robotic, a very advanced sort of device to advance this agenda of fear. And it actually says in the document the exact words from 1953 for psychological warfare value. Because here's the question. If there's a group of people, and there are, who want to be able to create further global dominion, but not on a path of peace, but of endless war and conflict and control through fear, you've got to have a bigger enemy than the Taliban. You've got to have a bigger enemy than, you see what I'm saying? So they're trying to create this mega enemy. And it's been a 70-year process. Now it's coming to a head because, unfortunately, the corporate media, not you, are sort of lapdogs of this covert group because it's all big money and big corporate integrated systems. And so the narrative that you end up seeing pushed through internet and through big networks and what have you is the threat of the UFOs. Well, there is a threat. The real threat, however, is not from the extraterrestrial ones. It's from the man-made ones, the rogue man-made elements that have studied the ET craft, perfected a lot of their systems, and then have weaponized them and have turned them on into these sort of frightening episodes. Another example are the animal mutilations you hear about. I mean, the top doctor in the world that investigated the first one of those, who was a colleague of mine, he's passed away, concluded that that was being done by a black ops team, a special forces team that had a lot of these advanced technologies, and it was being done for both experimental reasons and getting biological materials to be used in experiments by carving up these animals, but also for their psychological warfare value by leaving them out there, making it look like it was an alien mutilation. So I always tell people, be very careful on this subject. I would say 9 parts in 10 of everything you're going to come across is very well developed disinformation.
Interesting. Wow. So much today. Every time you speak, you give so much information. I almost don't know where to go next. But I'm going to ask you one of the most basic questions, just because I want to know. Have you personally, ever had contact? Well, let me rephrase that. Have you ever seen face to face an alien being?
Yes, I have. Absolutely.
How old were you?
That was the event in 1973. So I was 18. I just turned 18.
Okay, so you're old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, between fantasy and reality.
Oh, yeah.
In the 70s,
I never do any drugs. This was not on LSD in the 70s.
Okay, that's what I was about to ask you. You're coming out of the 60s. No. LSD.
I never touched the stuff.
Just took place. You're not on any magic mushrooms or anything at the time.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you describe?
Actually, this ET I'm talking about is probably about 4 to 5 feet tall. I didn't know what the heck was going on. And I was up on this mountain in outside Boone, North Carolina, up in the mountains. And this, at first I thought it was a deer on its hind legs looking at me. And because it had deer-like eyes. And it came over and touched my right shoulder so firmly I could see the indentation. And with that, there was an electromagnetic field. All my hair stood on. It's when I had hair, and all my hair stood on end. And it was this amazing event that happened with this being. So, and, it was not at all frightening to me. It was beautiful, but. And I think that what the interest of that particular experience, what those ETs was a young guy, 18, who had had a near-death experience, who understood consciousness and understood the central role of what's called in physics entanglement, where everything's connected in the consciousness field, but also in physics. And so in order to understand going from a far distant star system to here, you're not going to do that in a straight line at the speed of light. You're going to do it through understanding what the physicists call non-locality, where nothing has to be fixed in space-time. And this gets into some very advanced concepts. But the ultimate non-local field is you right there. You're awake and conscious. Your conscious mind is, if you were to calm it down, this is what meditation does, and calm it down, is actually connected to this field of consciousness that's everywhere, simultaneously everywhere. This is why the CIA had a very successful project dealing with what's called remote viewing, where people use certain techniques in consciousness and be able to see remote places. I got to know a lot of the really accomplished remote viewers who worked in that CIA program back years ago. And that program ran for 20, 30 years. People say, oh, that can't be. I said, oh, yeah, it is. It's like a seer. It's like a shaman or a seer who has the ability to see remote places or the future with consciousness. Now, think about technologies where you're dealing with civilizations that are 100,000 or more years advanced than us, many of them. All their technologies, we're using electromagnetic system here at the speed of light, right? 186,000 miles per second. They're using technologies that are interfacing with quantum thought. It's sort of like really advanced, what Elon Musk is working on with Neuralink, but not with wires and stuff, but where it's a consciousness field and thought interfacing with machine. And there's been a lot of research done by various scientists in the last few decades on this, where consciousness and thought can affect a machine or a random number generator, which are a quantum machine, basically, like Dr. John did at Princeton, at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, the Peer Lab. People should look that up. He was brilliant. I knew him. He really understood this whole idea of the consciousness field and matter and electromagnetism and being interconnected. So when you're dealing with extraterrestrial civilizations, they have perfected that the way we have perfected a cell phone or a video call or FaceTime. So that's the other thing people have to understand. You're not dealing with your granddad's Oldsmobile here. You're dealing with some really advanced technology, which the good part of it is that a lot of those technologies, if they're brought forward, and this is why I'm here in LA for this premiere of The Lost Century and How to Reclaim It, this new documentary that just has come out. It's about all these technologies. But if those were brought out, in 10 to 20 years, we'd have a new civilization here. But they have to be brought out wisely, and they have to be brought out for peaceful applications. And a lot of them have to be held back for a while, the things that fly, the things that are, anti-grav things that fly around. But the ones that just generate energy, that would, get us off oil and gas and coal and eliminate the poverty that's in the world very quickly. But, you're going to have certain losers too in that. You're going to have, countries and corporations and powerful people who have interest in the conventional energy systems of oil, gas, coal. Public utilities. You're not going to need a public utility. You'd have a box at your house that would be pulling energy out of what's called this zero-point energy field or quantum energy entangled field. And it'd run your house with no power bill, ever. Same thing with your car. You wouldn't have to plug it in like a Tesla. It'd be a real Tesla. Nikola Tesla had one. He had an electric car and never had to be plugged in. So the point I'm making here is that we really could restart civilization and put it back on track, but there are a lot of headwinds against it. I mean, think of the powerful interests that do not want that to happen. I mean, they're controlling wealth that is way dwarfs the entire budget of the United States, way more, orders of magnitude more. So that's the problem. And this is where.
So are you saying the cover, because
that's the heart of the cover up right there.
Yeah, because I was always under the assumption that the cover up, man wasn't ready for it. It would challenge everything we've ever been taught about God, about the Creator. It would challenge. We just didn't have the mental aptitude to understand and accept that there was life beyond what we knew.
Well,
are you saying
no? In the early days, no. I think in the early days there was concern about that. I think certainly now, since 60% of the population believe there's life out there, and more than that number now believe that the UFOs are real. Now that the Pentagon has admitted those objects that they have on sensors and cameras are real, and I've talked to the F-18 Hornet pilot who took that footage. So I mean, this is getting to be a settled question. I don't think. I think back in the 40s, 50s, there was some of that concern. There's still some of that concern from your more fanatical religious elements who don't want to accept that there's life anywhere but here. But that's the lunatic fringe, 10, 15%. I think most people accept that. I was at the Vatican talking to one of the chief theologians for the Pope some years ago, and he said, God is not so stupid to have left all of his hopes for intelligent life in the universe in just humans. It was very funny. It was a Monsignor Balducci. We have a great interview with him, by the way. He's passed away, but he is a wonderful guy. So I think most of the religions of the world would be able to incorporate this into their paradigm, because it doesn't detract from the glory of God, the fact that there's intelligent life throughout an infinite cosmos. I think it's more humans' hubris and egotism that might take a hit, because we think we're the top of the food chain in the whole cosmos, and we're sort of at the emerging level. We're an emerging civilization. And there are some, they call them our brothers and sisters more advanced, that are, thousands to millions of years more advanced. And we just have to accept that. But that's okay. We just have to accept that.
This will really mess with your brain in a major way, because it really does challenge everything that we've been taught throughout our entire
everything
schooling.
You've been taught is wrong, my friend. Well, not everything.
I'm listening to you, and I see. I see. I want to tackle.
I've always been a contrarian too, by the way. I've always gone, I've always questioned authority. I've always questioned the conventional wisdom. I've always challenged the beliefs, the firmly held beliefs. There's like that philosopher, George Santayana, that said, fanaticism consists of redoubling your effort when you've forgotten your goal. And so this pretty much describes all organized religion, political parties, institutions, social movements. They forget what the initiating goal was as they become more and more fanatical and then go sideways. So it's like the entire American experiment of a democratic republic has to be re-looked at, because how much of a democratic republic do we have and freedom if the most important technologies and information in the history of the United States is being held covertly by an unelected and unappointed group that is not being overseen by the president or the people's representatives in Congress? It makes a complete mockery of democracy and freedom. And so there are a lot of things people need to start challenging. Question of the freedom of the press. If everything I'm telling you is true, and it is, every word of it, and we have an 8 terabyte archive and 755 whistleblowers, not firsthand or not secondhand ones like some that have come out publicly that I've been involved with, but I mean firsthand, people who've dealt with the technology, dealt with this whole system. Why isn't that being covered in the media? It's because the media is not allowed to cover it. And why is that? It's because the big corporate and financial interests don't want this out because it's a vertically and horizontally integrated system. So here you have the whole, what's called the fourth estate, the freedom of the press in question. So I think there's all these issues are very large issues that need to be joined. Luckily, I've been providing information to the senior most people in the Senate and the House for the last year and a half, and they get it. I mean, the senior leaders there get it. That's why all these things are coming forward. And there are folks in the Pentagon who also are now awake to this problem, and they're fed up. You know, one group calls themselves the have-nots because they're very senior folks in the Pentagon who have been denied access to information, even though there are undercover top secret programs, operations dealing with this. And so this is the term they call themselves the have-nots. And of course, I've dealt with that since, you know, my coming of age on that was the CIA director, but then a couple years later, in 1997, I find this an astonishing story. There was a man who was the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, J2. So this would be the guy who is your main intelligence guy for the whole Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. And I was asked to do a stand-up briefing for him at the Pentagon. It was April 1997, so it's 26 years ago. And when I went in there, I took astronaut Edgar Mitchell with me, sixth man to walk on the moon. He had not seen anything. He just was, he was learning about all this. And then I brought this Eisenhower witness in and a couple other witnesses, military whistleblowers. And before I went to the meeting, I gave the admiral a packet, a briefing document. And so he could get a lot of information before we did our what's called a stand-up briefing for the admiral. And one of the documents is from Nellis, it's so-called Area 51. And it's from 1991. Now remember, this is 97. And it's not been declassified, but I have it. And so I put it in there, and it listed the project code names and numbers for a lot of these operations. So based on that, he made some inquiries. And here's what happened. Now, this is an admiral, J2, head of intelligence joint staff. He gets hold of one of these compartments that are dealing with this. And he says, "Oh, I'm Admiral Tom Wilson, blah, blah." They, "Oh, yes, sir, we know who you are." And he says, "I want to be read into Project X." And they said, "Sir, you don't have a need to know." And he said, "God damn it, excuse my language, I'm the head of intelligence joint chiefs of staff. How do I not have a need to know?" They said, "Sir, we will not discuss this with you." Hung up on him. He then subsequently got threatened personally and threatened with being demoted, have a star taken off his lapel. Now, I have proof of this.
Do you have this documented anywhere?
Oh, yeah. Of course we do. We have everything documented. My archive is 8 terabytes.
Okay, let me ask it a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have him on record
saying
saying that this is what happened to me?
The only thing on record about that is that there was a PhD scientist who recorded a conversation with him and made notes of it that got leaked out a couple years ago. And based on that, I had to respond because most of it was accurate. This memo's on the internet. It's the Admiral Wilson briefing that Dr. Greer did. No, this has all been established. But the problem becomes very quickly, what are you going to do when you have a situation where, and then a couple years later, there's something at the Pentagon called the Defense Intelligence Agency. It's basically CIA. It's the military intelligence organization for the Pentagon versus CIA civilian. And the director of it, General Patrick Hughes, back some years ago, also wanted to get information on this. He had been denied access. Now, you have to get your mind around this. This is a 3-star general in charge of the Defense Intelligence Agency being denied access. And I'm going into this meeting, and I go, he says, "Well, who else is in this situation?" I said, "Well, the president, the CIA director, and your colleague over there at J2, who had then moved on to ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence." But my point was, I said, this is a huge systemic problem. And this is what other senators now are awakening to right now on the Senate Intelligence and Armed Services Committee, and in the House on the Government Oversight Committee and Intelligence Committee, is that there is a massive operation going on that's rogue, unsupervised, and that has involved, quite frankly, trillions of dollars in funding that have not been accounted for. Trillions, not billions.
Understood. I wish that we had either the admiral, or the general on tape somewhere.
Oh, that didn't happen. These guys, after they got burned and stood down and threatened, they don't want any part of this. They don't want any part of it. But we have documentation for it. I have all my archive and correspondence and everything I'm telling you I can prove. I don't need to prove anything. But by the way, I don't need to prove anything. No offense to you or anyone else. I mean, my record stands for itself. But this is all factual. I only tell these stories to illustrate and put flesh on the bone of the nature of the secrecy and the problem we're facing. And it's a huge problem. It isn't something that can be waved off and wished away. It's going to take some very courageous people in and out of government to fix this in time. It
is going to take very courageous people to step forward. Yeah. That's exactly why I'm asking you the questions I'm asking you, because it seems like everyone is afraid of being demoted, a star taken off my lapel.
Yeah.
I'm going to be killed. At some point, you would like to see someone who is high up in the government say, hey, look, I didn't believe, I didn't know. But this is what I was exposed to.
Actually, to correct you, that's actually now happening. If you look at some of the senators and members of the House, well, Congressman Tim Burchett, who I've met with from Tennessee on the House Oversight Committee, he is publicly talking about this. Senator Marco Rubio and Mark Warner, the co-chair, Senate Intelligence, are openly talking about this. Senator Gillibrand, your senator from New York, openly talking about this and passing laws to get to the bottom of it. The UAP UFO issue. So that's happening. It's happening.
Well, we know that the
unfortunately
government
more slowly
is now,
than it should, but it's happening.
Yes, the government is now acknowledging that we need to look into this thing. We need full disclosure. You're absolutely right.
They know more than they're talking to. By the way,
okay, because I want to talk about the 3 big lies that you spoke about.
You're right.
You said, and I want to quote you here, there are 3 big lies that we as citizens of Earth are facing. Number 1 is we don't know what these things are. The government is telling us we don't know what these things are. Number 2, we don't have anything that can fly at those rates, angles, etc. And number 3, that extraterrestrials are a threat to national securities.
Right.
Can you go into depth with each of those 3 lies?
Sure, absolutely. The first one, after Unacknowledged, it came out in 2017, 6 years ago. It hit about 750 million people viewing it. And what happened is that they then stood up an operation from a counterintelligence expert out of the Pentagon, Luis Elizondo, who worked with a band member named Tom DeLonge, who I had mentored back when he was younger, when they were in the early 2000s. And Elizondo and that crowd stood up and started saying, yeah, well, there's something out there, and here's this footage, but we don't know what they are. Now, ironically, the footage that they were showing were from the Lockheed Skunk Works. Those were objects from the Lockheed Skunk Works. I know who worked on them. I know where they're deployed from. I know people who.
Is this here in the U.S.?
Yeah, that's out in the high desert out here. I have a photograph of the underground entry port for those out in the Mojave Desert. But we know where all the sites are. My list now has 145 facilities.
Okay, and I'm so sorry to interject, but I just want to get
we do know what they are. So that's a big lie that we don't know what these are. There are 2 types of UFOs: man-made, that are electrogravitic anti-gravs. The date that breakthrough happened where we had a stable anti-grav system was October 1954. 54, not 64, not 94. So those have begun to be experimented with and developed since the year before I was born in 1955. Now, the extraterrestrial vehicle is very different. Although they move in a similar way, they could be confused. So there are two things that are being confused as one thing. There are both extraterrestrial and man-made UAPs or UFOs. Now, until recently, the people in the government who were looking into this didn't know that. They were being gaslit or deceived by people going up there and saying, well, gee, we have no idea what these are. And one of the top investigators for the Senate who I'm working with, he'd be the equivalent of a 2 or 3 star general if he was still in the military, went out to the Lockheed Skunk Works, was shown a bunch of old antique jet aircraft. And he knew he was being gaslit and deceived. That's when they called me in. So that was in February of 2022. But they said, well, we got a problem here. We know there's something wrong with this picture. So they now know that was a big lie. The second big lie, which is of great concern, is that we don't know how these operate. Well, that's what they want everyone to believe, because if they were acknowledged, we know how these function, we'd be going, then what are we doing making solar panels and windmills when we have something that would be a box this big that would run this building 24 hours a day, rain or shine, or wind or no wind. So that's what this new documentary, The Lost Century and How to Reclaim It's about, because it's a whole century of these lost technologies. And we're having the premiere here in LA. The other issue is that these extraterrestrial civilizations are a threat. Let me assure everyone, they view us as a threat. Humans are viewed as a threat, not them. And if they were a threat, think about it. We start shooting these things down with electromagnetic systems, scalar, they're called, electromagnetic systems, in the 40s and 50s, 60s. If they were hostile, they're so far advanced with that, they just shut this whole civilization down. Now, it's in the interest of the warmongering, endless war psychopaths and sociopaths to convince the world population that there's a threat from out there, because that's how you unite the whole world. Unfortunately, poor Ronald Reagan was gaslit with this narrative. If you look at what's in Unacknowledged, our documentary, anyone can see it for free on all these sites now. He had a team of people. I knew the head of that team, who's passed away now, Colonel Holman, Air Force guy. And they were sent in there to convince Reagan of a threat like this to get funding for SDI, the so-called Star Wars, Strategic Defense Initiative. But one of the reasons why Ronald Reagan at the United Nations said, wouldn't our job of creating world unity be easier if we had a common alien threat to unite against? So now, I don't think he was a bad man. I think he had false information given to him, which is also the big risk right now with disclosure, is these same operators going and providing portfolios of false information to the Congress and to the White House and to the media, to the people. We know that's already happening. And so one of the big risks, and I wrote a paper in 1999, it's up on our website, this site, seriousdisclosure.com or drstephen.greer.com. You will see that I wrote in 1999 that if this goes sideways, they're going to take the disclosure of this subject and flip it into a War of the Worlds, Independence Day, the movie thing, and create global chaos and create a situation to unite the world around some non-existing threat from outer space. Because that was always the plan. You know, Carol Rosin, a member of my team who was the spokesperson for Werner von Braun, the guy who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, and who then became part of our aerospace industry back in the 45. He warned on his deathbed that they would hoax an alien threat, and it's all a lie. And that was the plan that they had come up with in the 50s. So we're now 70 years into this sort of a long-term plan to create a hoax, basically. So I tell people, yeah, there are extraterrestrials, aliens, if you want to call them. There are man-made craft. Those are the ones that are a threat. Those are the ones doing abductions, human trafficking, drug trafficking. They're being misused all over the place. If you look at what we just did at the National Press Club in Washington, you see that on my YouTube channel. We have a Marine who was on a rescue mission after the big Indonesian earthquake and tsunami in 2009. And Michael Herrera and his platoon came across one of these gigantic, about 300-foot diameter, man-made UFOs, all floating weapons, and there were crates. And we later learned, he first thought they were drugs. We later learned from other sources those were people in there being put into slavery to be used in experimentation.
Meaning human beings.
Human. Oh, yeah, children, women, yeah. Specific ones, yeah, to be used. So, I mean, these sort of these rogue operations are a serious problem. And luckily, all that information is being handed over to the authorities at the Pentagon and in the Congress and the White House, in the White House military office that I deal with. But, you know, whether or not there'll be a satisfactory action or outcome by the leaders in the political system is to be determined. I don't know. We're doing everything we can. I think everyone listening to this show should write to their senators and their congressmen and to the White House, the president, and say, you need to look into this and the details of it, but also be aware of the false narrative that's going to be presented to you. Because the false narrative is where we run into problems. You know, if the establishment gets convinced that there is this kind of threat, which doesn't exist from outer space, they could pivot the whole world into a situation where, you know, everyone would be in sort of a lockdown situation through the fear of a sort of a hoaxed threat from outer space. And I think that's why we did 2 years ago the Cosmic Hoax, which is a documentary about this. It's on our YouTube channel. Because I think that the big risk here of disclosure is that it is taken and then sort of spun in the wrong direction, a false direction. But you have to ask the question, who would benefit from that? Well, the same profiteers and sociopaths that have been benefiting from the secrecy all along. And I think this is a real problem, because I think that ultimately, if the people aren't informed, and this is what Eisenhower said, you know, he talked about beware the military-industrial complex. He was an anti-military. He was a 5-star general, a World War II hero, a 2-term Republican president. It wasn't Abby Hoffman that said that, or some hippie. It was General Eisenhower. But the reason he said that, and then he said only an informed citizenry can protect our democracy. So the question is, how do we inform the citizenry? And that's why, you know, your show is so important.
Okay, so I understand, based on what you're saying, why the government and big corporations would want to keep this thing under wraps.
Mm-hmm.
The aliens, according to you, they are light years ahead of us in terms of technology, in terms of understanding.
Right.
What's their motive? Why did? Because I saw the interview with you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's a great question. I'm happy to answer it. I think there are multiple issues here. One, I don't think it's anything new that this planet and humans have been observed by extraterrestrial civilizations. I mean, there are cave drawings from 5,000 years ago that show a classic UFO with these life forms outside of it. There's artwork from the 1400s that demonstrate and show these objects in the sky with a beam of light coming down. There's a cave in India that has similar artwork. But I think that the modern era, let's call it the modern era where there's so much of this going on, coincided precisely with the detonation and development and then detonation of the first atomic weapons. Because when we detonate those things, what we didn't know, what Oppenheimer and Teller, all the people who worked on the Manhattan Project didn't know, there's an electromagnetic pulse that goes out, everybody's heard of, knocks out your electronics, electric grid. But there's also this scalar. Now, a scalar pulse is multiples of the speed of light. And it is in this entangled aspect of quantum physics, and it disrupts extraterrestrial travel and communications. So that got everyone's attention out there, these other star systems. And that's why every single nuclear bomb squadron, processing facility, ICBM site, et cetera, and so on, here, UK, France, Soviet Union, Russia, have had some sort of UFO surveillance because they're so concerned about those. Not only for us destroying this planet, but the risks they pose. So I think that's one of their concerns. There's a certain amount of interest in protecting life on Earth, but there's also enlightened self-interest. Secondly, I think they're concerned that the technologies we've gotten from studying these extraterrestrial vehicles that we have downed are now being turned into weapon systems targeting extraterrestrial vehicles out in space. So this technology curve, it may have gone slowly from 45 to 54. It was like this, and then it could boom. And so it's a nonlinear development of technologies covertly that aren't under the supervision of most of the Pentagon and White House and even CIA and Congress. It's in this rogue operation that tells very little of what they have, and they can use those technologies to do two dangerous things. Stage a fake alien attack, sort of a false flag, which I think is imminent, frankly. And secondly, target extraterrestrial assets, which is a huge risk, right? Where at some point you have to ask the question, even though I'm quite convinced these ET civilizations are fundamentally peaceful, you don't know where is the red line. How far can you push into this and create a threat where humans are a threat before they have to intervene? But I don't think the ETs are going to just land on the White House lawn. What I think is, to be honest with you, the ETs are expecting the children of Earth to fix this problem. So I think there's an expectation that humans need to fix this, as opposed to them landing here and fixing it for us. So I think their presence has been very nuanced up till now, and it should be. I mean, think about it. We're an evolving civilization. I don't know if you have children, but it's sort of like if a child reaches the point where it's trying to toddle around, if every time it started to fall, you picked it up and wouldn't let it fall and get its leggings, that child would never walk. So humanity is at this point of emergence from the jungle to city-states to the last 100 years, sort of a technological civilization. If there was an intervention that wide and overt by other civilizations, it would actually cause our evolution to slow down and not enable us to exert our own free will, back to where we started this conversation, to create a better world and learn the lessons collectively humans need to learn, that we have to learn. So I think they're wise enough. I think if I figured this out, I'm sure they figured it out, right? So I think they understand this and they want us to be able to get this right. Now, the question is, how far can they let us muck things up? Because right now, I mean, we're screwing up the biosphere. We're screwing up. We have 3 billion people on the planet. I don't know if you know this, that don't have any means of even cooking their food. They're cutting down rainforests and shrubs in the desert. 3 billion of the 8 billion people have no means to cook their food. So the level, I mean, in America, we don't know what poverty is compared to the rest of the world if you travel. And so a world like that is fundamentally unstable because this sort of have and have-nots ultimately leads to disgruntled cultures terrorism, all kinds of problems. So all of these are interrelated. And so delaying the release of this knowledge and information 70 years has not been smart. Now, in the short run, because, yeah, it seemed justifiable. In the long run, it's turned out to be a debacle, disaster. So now what we're trying to do, this is why I call this in the lost century, there's a century of this lost evolution, technology, social evolution. But I think in a 10-year to 20-year period, even within my lifespan, never mind yours, this could be corrected. I'm very optimistic that it can be fixed. I really am. I wouldn't be doing this if I thought it was hopeless. So now the extraterrestrial civilizations, they're waiting for us to do a couple of things. First, get this resolved. Secondly, quit targeting them and hitting their craft with these weapons. And then thirdly, officially reach out peacefully to them, right? Why aren't we doing that? You know, we don't see the State Department or the UN or foreign ministries of other countries because the issue has been kept so marginalized and ridiculed and left on the sideline that there is nothing. That's why I started the whole Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind contact, the CE5 contact effort. It's sort of have humans show a different face to these civilizations besides just a military approach or a weapon approach. And I think that's what we can do individually now. But I think the governments of the world are going to have to get their minds around this pretty quickly because the danger is this rogue group have technologies. We don't have time to go into it, but it would, whatever you think, and this is what Ben Rich, the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works, this super secret contractor for Lockheed, said on the week before he died to a member of our team, James Goodall, a very famous aerospace illustrator, historian. He said, anything you have seen on Star Trek and can imagine, we've already done at the Lockheed Skunk Works, and it's not out at Area 51. It's out in the desert of California there. So now, if all those technologies were looked at and applied towards healing diseases, fixing the biosphere, eliminating poverty, et cetera, and so on, we'd have a new civilization. But if they're used only for targeting and aggressive approaches to the extraterrestrials, we could be looking at an extinction level event on this planet. I mean, really catastrophic. So we have some very big decisions to make collectively in the next, I would say, 2 to 3 years max.
You mentioned earlier, and it's the first time in our conversation, I believe it was Russia or Germany. But typically, whenever I hear about downed spacecrafts, mysteriously, it always happens in the U.S.
Oh, no. It's happened all over the world.
Not sightings. I'm talking about downed.
I am too.
So you're saying outside of the U.S.?
Oh, multiple. Yeah.
Really?
Yep. South Africa, Africa, Russia, Germany.
Okay. Yeah. So do they have the same technologies that we have?
Well, this gets complicated.
Okay.
The organization we're talking about is transnational. It's not only U.S., meaning that it has corollaries and components in every country. And it moves with alacrity, freedom, across all political boundaries. So when I was up at a skiff a couple years ago with some guys, intelligence guys, and I said, you see that map of the world behind you right up there above the conference table? Take all the lines between all the countries, erase them. Because the organization who is running this operation is transnational, not international. Big difference. International is like U.S. to Canada, This is transnational, transcends those boundaries. So you have to understand the architecture, the structure of this organization, which I understand very, very well. And so, for example, we have operations in Mexico, out at Fort Huachuca, which was Army Intelligence Headquarters out in the desert of Arizona. There's a DUM, a deep underground military base storage area there, has a man on my team who was there in the 70s. There were 9 extraterrestrial vehicles that were stored there and dead extraterrestrial bodies that had been dissected and autopsied, whatever. Many of those had been pulled out of Latin America or Mexico and brought back and were moved across borders. I think, we're trained to think in our high school civics lesson about geopolitics and political and boundaries. You got to erase that when you're dealing with this particular these operations. And that's another big problem for the United States government, is I've warned them, you're going to have to take a global approach to this eventually. First, you need to get your head around what's going on in CONUS, the continental United States, and our security. But ultimately, you're going to have to consider the rest of the world. Because these operations, as I mentioned, the CIA document talks about going across the border into Brazil and Argentina, conducting abductions on innocent civilians for their psychological warfare value. So these operations are not restricted to the United States, nor have the downing and retrieval of these objects been restricted to the United States. So that's another whole layer of discussion. It's hard to make this so complex, but it is complex. It's just
it's extremely complex.
Extraordinarily.
And it really
shootings and stabbings were easier, my friend. Give me a good old fashioned, gunshot wound to the chest. But no, I think that it is very, very complex, and it isn't what people are trained to think. So part of the problem.
Well, that's part of the complexity of it all. Is you literally have to unlearn everything that you've been taught. You have to go into this with an open mind, because even me sitting here before you. I know you're a medical doctor. You are highly intelligent. But I have to, and I say this with all of the respect, and I have been following you for years. I have to say, you're speaking about things that in some ways can sound like conspiracy theory.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
In other ways, I would have to question your own sanity. Is this guy, is he with us, or is he just so far out there that he actually sounds intelligent saying the things that he's saying? So,
it's all true, and we can document it. The nice thing about the things I'm sharing is that I have documentation for all of it. Not that you can do that in a 2-hour show, but I think that's what I'm providing to people in the U.S. government. Here are the files, here are the witnesses. Here are the people who handled this directly. So I think that's where it has to be. It has to be evidence-based. Now, what I'm giving you are the assessments and the big picture here. But I'm trying to illustrate it with various examples, like this Marine who came across this Indonesian trafficking and the use of one of these objects, which anyone who would look at it and how it took off.
Are we talking about the Tic Tac video?
No, I'm talking about the Marine that was in Indonesia with the apparently human trafficking and the big UFO during the tsunami that I just referred to. Michael Herrera, it's up on our YouTube channel. His interview was just done at the National Press Club in Washington. It's there free for anyone to see. I tell people, don't take my word for it. I have 70 or 80 of these firsthand military guys up on our YouTube channel. But I think that it is hard because everyone has been sold sort of a mythology and been kept in an information blackout for 70, 80 years. So how do you catch up for 70 or 80 years of lies and brainwashing and disinformation? It's hard, but we don't have 70 or 80 more years to fritter away. Here's the problem. So my issue, and I very much appreciate what you're saying. In 1991, an intelligence official said to me, he said, Dr. Greer, if you tell the public the truth about this, you will be discredited because the truth is much more bizarre than the fiction we've been selling.
Correct.
Right? So, but that puts you in a double bind. It's a catch-22. I am not going to any longer hold back on what the full information on this is, because this is all coming out now. I mean, even the mainstream media is covering it with their spin and filters. But the Congress and people in the Pentagon who are looking into this in great depth are now finding out about this. And so, we don't have another decade or even another year or two, I think, to fritter time away. I think we're going to have to move quickly. And yes, it's going to be a bit of a future shock to people, but it's got to happen, because the world most people believe now is the equivalent of, when we thought the earth was flat, or that the sun went around the earth. And remember, 500 years ago, Galileo was excommunicated by the church for daring to suggest that the planets went around the sun. That was heresy. That was completely too mind-boggling.
Mm-hmm. Yep,
that was just about 500 years ago. So I think we have to begin to think very critically, critical thinking. But what I tell people is that look at the evidence. I mean, we have 5 books that are out. We have these 5 documentaries. This new one on the lost century and how to reclaim it has just come out. Anyone can look at it. And it documents this 100 years of this technology being developed. But also, what the nice thing about it, it looks into the future. It looks at 10 years, 20, 50, 100, 1,000 years from now. What is this planet going to look like when we disclose finally this information? And with it, the energy technologies that would give us a completely different planet. And that's, ironically, the old cartoon, The Jetsons, George Jetson. What was being portrayed in the early 60s there, that technology existed at that time. It literally existed. It was a cartoon, but it actually was stuff that we had.
And I remember the Jetsons. Yeah. Meet George Jetson.
George Jetson.
There you go.
So go look at the cartoon. Flying around, flying these things. I mean, of course, it's a comedy and cartoon, but that actually could have been in the 60s because we mastered the technologies between 1945 and 54, that decade.
That Tic Tac video that we saw, which has now been seen worldwide hundreds of millions of times.
Yep.
Do you believe that that's man-made, or do you believe that really?
Yeah, that's a Lockheed Skunk Work object.
Okay, let me no. How do you know? You said you said very definitively, I know it is. How do you know that
we have a military witness, and if you look at the disclosure materials that we did for the 2-day weekend on June 10th and 11th, that's also up on our website. One of the witnesses was in 1991 in the Azores and saw that same craft being offloaded off a C-130 transport. And his life was threatened because he saw that. We also have a sighting of the exact same object in 1967 near Wickham, Pennsylvania. There are witnesses that we have the report and we have the drawing, the artist's drawing of it. Now, a lot of these objects that people are seeing, they're gaslighting the Congress and the public and the media saying, gee, we don't know what these are. It's a sleight of hand. Like the hell we don't know what they are. Those objects that have been shown are actually footage taken by our fighter jet pilots of these objects, but they don't know. They're not read in or briefed on these rogue super secret projects. To them, it could be an alien craft, but it's not. And that's the other danger, because one of the things I said to senior flag officers, admiral generals at the Pentagon, is that our conventional military could be caught flat-footed, not knowing whether something is it friend or foe. And here's the problem. If you're a general or an admiral or a commander or even a F-18 pilot, and you come across something like this and you don't know that it's man-made and you take actions, there are all kinds of consequences to that. One of the Disclosure Project cases that came out in the 90s and early 2000s, that's in the book Disclosure, and in on our website, the full testimony of this military guy was from the Atlantic Command. The Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Command, SINC Atlantic Command, Admiral Harry Train, was there when an object came in, this was like in 81, early 80s, came in from Newfoundland, and we scrambled jets all up and down the eastern seaboard. It was on 5 radar stations. And the order was given. He panicked, and he ordered to shoot that thing down after confirming it was neither Soviet nor ours. But what was it? He was not read into the extraterrestrial issue or the man-made ones. And he was going to engage in a kinetic, i.e. missile, firing. And he did. He attempted to hit it, didn't. It moved over the South Atlantic and then went straight out into space. But this sort of information vacuum, lack of knowledge by people in mission-critical operations, they're the ones most at risk, believe it or not. Ironically, the people most at risk with this secrecy are military and intelligence people not read in, and people in the government. So when people say the government is keeping stuff from us, I say, well, which government? The government Senator Inouye talked about the secret government programs, or the actual mainline government. And I'm not talking about conventional black projects. I know the guys who manage the black budget of the United States currently. They are not read into this, or weren't. So this is a rogue operation. I mean, so I tell people, when you're dealing with something like that, that is a national security risk. Interesting, one thing I point out, and this is in all our materials, there was an early CIA director from right after Roswell, when the CIA was formed, named Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter. And Admiral Hillenkoetter, after he left that position and after Eisenhower left office, he wrote a letter to the New York Times, and he said, and I'm quoting, "The secrecy around UFOs is a threat to the national security." He didn't say the UFOs were a threat to the national security. He said the secrecy around it. That's a very important distinction. Now that went boom right over everyone's head in 1961. And here we are, 62 years later? Now we need to start figuring this out quickly.
You said something that I want to tap into for a second. You said that let's call it a UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, that Tic Tac video that we all see, that is man-made.
Yes.
Is it man-driven, for lack of a better? Are there pilots inside of it? Is it remote control? Can man even stand the speed and the propulsion and the way that thing has defied gravity?
Well, yeah, that particular one is thought to be unmanned, but the larger ones, like the ones that I'm talking about, that was the Marine ran across in Indonesia, and he and his 5 buddies were almost killed for just seeing this thing. That was 300 feet diameter, and it was definitely manned with pilots. And I know I have interviewed some guys who have piloted the man-made. Some people call them advanced technology, others call them ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, and those, what they do, imagine if you're an electromagnetic bubble, an electromagnetic field propulsion system, and it corrects for 1G. So in other words, you can be moving at 200,000 miles per hour or make a right-hand turn. Normally that would kill anybody with normal G forces.
Correct.
But the technology accounts for 1G. So you just don't feel it. So you're in this sort of electromagnetic bubble. It's also why there's no sonic boom. These things can be cutting through the air. Now you would think you go past the speed, of sound.
You took my next
boom.
Question from me. That was my next question. Why is there no sonic boom?
Well, the same reason. It's the basis of it's the technology itself. So you actually have the object moving in an electromagnetic field bubble that the air bends around it and isn't split. So a sonic boom is when the air is, you go through so fast it collapses back on itself and boom, like after lightning. Right? It splits the air and it comes back. So what these are, it just slips right through. Same thing with water. These objects can go straight in water and move through the water at enormous speeds because it creates this electromagnetic bubble, space-time bubble, which it's moving through. So it has to do with physics We understand this quite well, frankly, of how this is doing, how they're operating that way. But it also explains aspects of the phenomenon.
Again, this is so much to digest here.
That's all right.
Elon Musk, you spoke about him earlier in the conversation.
I don't know him personally, but
no, but I'm just saying we brought his name up. He and his company SpaceX, they just launched one of the most powerful rockets ever created on Earth towards Mars. He believes that Mars needs to be colonized. Do you think that we'll ever see a day when humans are colonizing on other planets?
We might, if we become peaceful. Here's your entry ticket to the cosmos. That you're what's called a level 1 civilization. Earth right now is a level 0. A level 1 civilization is peaceful, has developed the technologies so that they're not destroying their own biosphere, and they can go out into space with that peaceful intent. If that doesn't happen, you're not allowed to go very far. You're basically blocked by these other civilizations, as you should be, because you're not civilized. We are not yet a real civilization, frankly. Not any real on a universal cosmic definition. We're emerging civilization. So I think we will in the future. I think if we get this right and begin to function as a peaceful civilization, we will be going not only to other planets in our solar system, we'll be going to other star systems because that capability absolutely exists. But I think to do that, we have to change our consciousness, our social fabric. We're going to have to accept that seeing everything we don't understand, it doesn't mean that you have to kill it. That's the whole problem. If you're a hammer, the whole world's a nail. We have to begin to look at things we don't understand in a way that doesn't immediately move us over into shoot first, ask questions later mindset, which is what happened with this whole issue in the 40s and 50s. So I think that if we get that right, sure. Now, as far as SpaceX, that's a rocket. Rockets were cool when Werner von Braun invented them in the 40s for Adolf Hitler in Germany. We haven't needed rockets since October of 1954. But Elon Musk would not have been read into those projects. He's doing the best he can with what he has. My uncle worked on the lunar module, which were little jet thrusters and rockets that landed on the moon. He was doing the best with what he was allowed to have. He wasn't allowed to have these other exotic, let's call them advanced technologies. So I think that until we get this issue sorted out, then that's what we're left with. But going up in a Roman candle or a rocket is not how you're really going to explore either this solar system or other star systems.
Okay, my last question for you is a very basic question, if you will.
Sure.
What does you personally have had 3 encounters with extraterrestrials? Once when you were very young, another when you were 18, and I believe another when you were in your 30s. We have found alien species alive. What does the communication look like? Is there communication? Is it telekinetic? Do we speak the same language? Like, what does actual communication between humans and alien beings look like, if it does exist?
It does exist, but it's gonna be, as I mentioned earlier, consciousness and thought interface with technologies. So I have a old McDonnell Douglas that became part of, and Phantom Works became part of Boeing, scientist on my team, and he's probably in his 90s now. But back in the 60s, they were investigating an event that happened that old man McDonnell Douglas sent him on a mission, and this person had an encounter with an extraterrestrial being, and the ET had some sort of little black rectangular box that was attached to him. And the person who had the encounter was clearly receiving thought, and as if you would hear it, but it was a clear transmission through consciousness and thought, but electronically. And it was in English, because apparently it goes through this sort of universal translator that is consciousness emerging into a thought. So, let's say the word apple. You could see a red apple, I see a red apple. We're using the English word apple. But imagine if the communication system did it on the level of the essence of that thing itself and then popped it into your language. Does that make sense? This is really advanced.
Perfect sense.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. So it's that sort of technological interface with thought and consciousness. So I called this, in 1991, I wrote a series of papers. One of them talked about consciousness-assisted technologies, where you assist the technology with your own conscious and thought. But there's the reverse. There's technology that assists your own consciousness and thought ability to transmit. So I call it TAC and CAT. But those are very much at the core of interstellar civilizations, because they're not going to communicate at the speed of light. I mean, imagine if you're from the Andromeda galaxy, and our advanced CE5 contact team, if you look at the movie Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, you can see it anywhere for free now, and it shows the picture of this ET from the Andromeda galaxy right outside our circle, and where we're out in the desert Joshua Tree, and it's there floating in the desert waving. Now, that being, from Andromeda, that's a galaxy 2.5 million light years from here. At the speed of light, it would take you 2.5 million years to get there. That's covering 186,000 miles every second for 2.5 million years, right? That's the distance. Light year is a measure of distance. That's how far, but that's how long it would take in time at the speed of light. Forget a rocket. So we know that these civilizations have to have developed technologies that go beyond the speed of light, both for transportation and communication. So that's the core of it right there. And so it makes total sense. It sounds kind of like, whoa, that's kind of far out there, what we're talking about in terms of thought and consciousness interfacing with machine and technology. But there's no other way it would happen. There's just no way it's going to happen through a normal speed of light transmission like we use a cell phone or a video conference.
Wow, incredibly fascinating stuff. Dr. Greer, this has been my pleasure.
It was great meeting you.
It's so fantastic to meet you. I thank you for, I thank you for being courageous enough and bold enough to come forward with your findings. You obviously know that you're going to be met with skeptics and doubters and people that are not ready to believe. But so much of what you're saying, it's grounded in real people and real accounts, and you have so much data on everything that you speak of. So I applaud you.
Thank you
for your courageousness, and I thank you, and I also want to congratulate you on your new film. You mentioned it several times, The Lost Century.
Hey, give it a look. I wish you could come to the premiere.
So do I. If you do it, if you do it again, I'd love to be there.
Hey, set up one in New York. Set one up in New York. We'll do it. No.
Absolutely, I will. But continue with your good work. I look forward to sitting down with you again. I think that you're one of the most fascinating people I've ever spoke to. So
thank you.
Continue blessings and success.
Thank you. Hope to see you soon.